She was 18 and alone in the world. No family safety net, no savings account, no forwarding address. Just a canvas duffel bag and a crumpled $2 bill she had kept hidden inside her left shoe for 3 weeks. And with that $2 she bought a forgotten millineress shop hidden on a once bustling street in Troy, Rensselaer County, New York, a building that had vanished from county tax maps in Mochinchambonmi too. The roof sagged under the weight of decades of damp leaves and neglect. The front display windows were boarded over with grey, splintering pine that had bowed inward from the rot. The county condemned it, slated for demolition following the autumn. But what nobody knew was that inside a giant oak hat block, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 24 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're re-watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Bowden had been holding her breath her whole life without knowing it. Childhood had not been a place of warmth, but a sequence of quiet suppressions and measured expectations. She grew up in a narrow brick row house in Albany, where the floors were scrubbed verkepite hat harsh lye soap twice a week, and the heavy canvas curtains were kept drawn against the unpredictable world outside. The house smelled perpetually of floor wax, boiled cabbage and damp wool. Her parents were practical people, bound by the rigid, unyielding belief that security was the singular virtue worth pursuing in a precarious world. They had survived lean years and economic recessions by making themselves small, by drawing no attention, and by carefully hoarding their meagre resources. They envisioned a life for Clara that mirrored their own, a life that was manageable, colourless, and entirely predictable. They spoke in terms of Clark S desks, typing pools, and pension plans. Creativity, in their household, was considered an unnecessary indulgence, and passion was viewed as a dangerous liability that led only to ruin. Clara learned early to mute her own voice. She learned to walk down the hallway without making the floorboards creak, to eat her dinner without letting her silverware scrape against the porcelain plate, and to speak only when a direct question required a direct. She moved through the cramped, dimly lit rooms of the row house like a ghost haunting her own life, a quiet observer of the structured monotony that defined her family's existence. The only object of value in the living room was a heavy black cast-iron typewriter which sat squarely on a dedicated table like a domestic altar. From the age of 12, Clara was expected to sit at that table for an hour every evening, striking the stiff mechanical keys to build her speed, preparing for the clerical future her father had firmly mandated. The only sanctuary she had ever known, the only place where she was permitted to draw a full breath, was the third-floor attic room belonging to her great-aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was a tall, angular woman who smelled faintly of dried lavender, peppermint oil, and the sharp tang of machine grease. She was a former seamstress and milliner, who, in her youth, had constructed elaborate structured garments for the city's fleeting theatre crowds and wealthy merchant wives. Her hands were scarred with 1,000 tiny needle pricks, the knuckles swollen kepte hat arthritis, but they moved with a precise fluid grace that Clara found mesmerizing. Every Saturday afternoon, while her parents listened to the news broadcasts on the radio in the parlour below, Clara would silently climb the narrow, uncarpeted stairs to the attic. The air up there was different, warmer, dustier, thick, with the scent of aged silk and cedar wood. The room was crowded with canvas-covered dress forms, heavy oak-cutting tables, and wooden spools of silk thread organised by subtle gradations of colour that Clara's parents would never have possessed the vocabulary to name. There, surrounded by the quiet tools of a forgotten trade, Clara learned the dignity of making something by hand. Beatrice did not demand speed or efficiency. She demanded patience. She taught Clara how to thread a fine needle without looking, relying solely on the sensitive pads of her fingertip. She taught her how to feel the bias grain of a fabric, how to listen to the distinct sound the heavy steel shears made when cutting through heavy wool versus delicate organza. It was an education in texture, in weight, in the slow, deliberate shaping of raw material into something of lasting purpose. For those few hours every week, the harsh lye soap and the black typewriter ceased to exist. The hands must listen before they speak. Clara, Beatrice would murmur, guiding Clara S. small fingers over a piece of stiffened felt. The fabric knows what it wants to be. You are simply helping it remember. Those Saturdays were the foundational anchors of Clara S. youth. In the quiet companionship of the attic, she was not a future typist or a silent daughter. She was an apprentice to a craft that demanded her full, undivided attention, a craft that rewarded care and punished haste. It was the only place in the world where her quietness was an asset, rather than a symptom of suppression. Her mother was a woman who waged a perpetual, silent, and ultimately futile war against the concept of unpredictability. For her, the world was a dangerous, chaotic organism that could only be managed through relentless domestic scheduling. She measured the passing of the days not by the shifting of the light or the changing of the seasons, but by a rigid calendar of chores that Clara was expected to memorize and execute flawlessly. Every Saturday morning, regardless of the weather, Clara was required to scrub the front concrete steps of the row house with a stiff bristled brush and a bucket of diluted bleach. If it was raining, the bleach mixed with the rainwater and burned the skin on her wrists. If it was freezing, the water crystallized on the concrete before she could wipe it dry. Her mother would stand inside the glass storm door, her arms folded, watching for any missed corner or lingering stain. There was absolutely no music permitted in the house. Clara's father equated music with idleness, and idleness with moral decay. The only sound that regularly broke the heavy silence of the evening was the monotonous, authoritative drone of the local news broadcaster emanating from the wood-panelled radio in the... Clara would sit on the stiff, horsehair-stuffed sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap, listening to reports of distant wars, fluctuating grain prices, and municipal zoning disputes. She felt as though she were trapped inside a meticulously constructed diorama, a life that had been written, edited, and finalized long before she was ever born. Her father's occupation as a ledger clerk for a regional shipping firm bled deeply into his domestic persona. He viewed Clara not as a daughter to be nurtured, but as a column of figures that needed to balance. He tracked her school grades, her modest expenditures, and her chore completion rates with the same grim, unyielding scrutiny he applied to his shipping manifests. Any deviation from the expected norm was met not vekep tehat anger, but with a terrifying, disappointed silence that could stretch for days. To survive in that environment, Clara had perfected the art of making herself small. She learned to breathe shallowly, to walk softly, and to bury her imagination so deeply that she sometimes feared she had forgotten where she hid. As Clara grew older, the lessons in the attic deepened, shifting from the basic mechanics of needle and thread to the demanding, structural art of millinery. Beatrice possessed an array of wooden hat blocks, heavy, solid pieces of carved oak and maple, shaped like crowns and brims. She showed Clara how to stretch damp felt over the blocks, pulling and pinning with deliberate force, using steam to coax the stubborn fibers into permanent curves. It was laborious, physical work. The steam burned Clara's knuckles, and the heavy pins left deep indentations in her thumbs, but she loved the exactness of it. She loved how a flat, shapeless piece of material could be forced, through patience and heat, to hold a rigid architectural form. A good hat is what protects you from the storms of the world, Beatrice used to say, her arthritic fingers smoothing a piece of deep green velvet over a wooden crown. She would pin it into place, her breath shallow but steady. It is not just fabric, Clara. It is a roof for the mind. It tells the rain it cannot have you. Clara internalized those words, treating them as a private gospel. She began to view the hats they repaired and constructed not as mere accessories but as armor. But time, unlike the steam-molded felt, could not be pinned into place. Beatrice's hands grew stiffer, her movements slower, until she could no longer hold the heavy shears. Clara took over the physical labor, acting as the hands while Beatrice sat in a worn armchair, providing the voice. The sanctuary of the attic was abruptly shattered when Clara was 16. Beatrice passed away quietly in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in November, just as the first hard frost settled over Albany. The loss was profound and entirely silent. Clara was not permitted to grieve openly. Her parents found excessive displays of emotion to be untidy and disruptive to the household routine. 3 days after the funeral, Clara's father took a week off from his ledger work to clear out the attic. He approached the task with a grim, ruthless efficiency. He saw no value in the tools of a dead trade. The heavy wooden hat blocks, the canvas-covered dress forms, the careful ledgers of measurements, all of it was hauled down the narrow stairs and dragged to the curb. The spools of fine silk thread, the specialty needles, the boxes of vintage ribbons, and the heavy steel shears were swept into thick black trash bags and taken to the municipal dump. Clara stood in the doorway of the attic, her hands curled into tight fists inside the pockets of her woolen skirt. She watched the only evidence of her true self, the only physical proof of the hours she had spent learning the weight of the world, being discarded as refuge. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg him to stop. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency her family did not accept, and that protesting would only accelerate the destruction. She simply stood in the doorway and committed the exact shape of the empty room to memory. The tension in the brick row house tightened like a coiled steel spring over the next 2 years. With Beatrice gone, the protective buffer between Clara and her parents' expectations vanished. Her father, a man whose deliberate silence was heavier and more oppressive than most men shouting, increased the pressure. He began bringing home application forms for municipal typing pools, filing clerk positions, and secretarial school. He would leave them squarely on her pillow or beside her dinner plate, a wordless, escalating demand for compliance. Clara tried to submit. She knew the mechanics of survival required income and shelter. She sat at the black cast-iron typewriter in the living room, practicing her keystrokes until her fingertips were bruised and aching. But the clattering, repetitive, mechanical noise felt like a physical erasure of her own spirit. Every stroke of the keys was a reminder of the quiet, deliberate sound the shears used to make cutting through thick wood. She felt herself shrinking, folding inward, becoming the small, colourless thing her parents required her to be. She managed to salvage only one item from the destruction of the attic, a small rusted pair of fabric snips that had fallen behind the baseboard near the window. She kept them hidden beneath her mattress, occasionally taking them out in the dead of night just to feel the cold, familiar weight of the metal against her palm. It was a meagre anchor, but it was enough to keep her tethered to the memory of who she actually was. As her 18th birthday approached, the stack of blank application forms on her desk grew taller, and the air in the house grew correspondingly thinner, until Clara felt she was suffocating in plain sight. Beatrice did not sugarcoat the reality of the trade. She often told Clara stories of her early years as a master milliner during the golden age of the 1920s, a time when a hat was not an accessory but a requirement for public existence. She recounted the grueling commission she accepted in 1928, tasked with constructing a heavily structured, wide-brimmed felt hat for a visiting European opera singer. The process, Beatrice explained, was agonizing. It involved sourcing genuine, undyed ostrich feathers from a dealer in New York City and plunging her bare hands into a boiling copper vat filled with toxic aniline dyes to achieve the exact shade of aubergine the singer demanded. "The chemicals burned the skin right off my fingertips," Beatrice told her, holding her scarred hands up to the dim light of the attic. Mott could not hold a cup of tea for a week. But when she walked onto the stage at the Capitol Theatre, the light caught the felt and it glowed like dark amethyst. True craft requires a willingness to suffer for the detail, Clara. If you are not willing to bleed for the work will be hollow and the rain will eventually get through. Clara took those words as a solemn oath. Under Beatrice's exacting supervision, she spent hours practicing basic whip stitches and blind hems on discarded scraps of muslin and heavy cotton. She learned the vital, unforgiving muscle memory required to pull the silk thread with the exact same tension every single time, ensuring the fabric never puckered or gathered unevenly. When the sharp tip of the hand-forged needle inevitably slipped and pierced the pad of her index finger, Clara did not flinch. She simply wiped the bead of bright red blood onto a scrap of rag, applied a piece of stiff medical tape, and picked up the needle again. The pain was not a punishment, it was a tuition fee. It was the physical cost of transforming herself from a silent daughter into someone who possessed the power to make things. The breaking point arrived on a deeply humid evening in late August, 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. The heat in Albany had been relentless, trapping the smell of exhaust and melting asphalt between the brick buildings. Clara sat at the dining table, a cooling plate of boiled potatoes in front of her. Beside the plate lay a formal letter offering her a preliminary interview for a filing clerk position at a large insurance firm downtown. Her father sat across from her, his posture rigid, waiting for the expected nod of gratitude and compliance. Clara looked at the letter. She looked at Maltby, the heavy black typewriter in the corner. Then, with a calmness that surprised even herself, she pushed the letter back across the table. She stated quietly and evenly that she would not be attending the interview. She explained that she intended to seek work as an apprentice seamstress or a tailor-s assistant, even if it meant sweeping floors for minimum wage. The silence that followed was absolute. Her father did not yell. He did not slam his fist against the table or offer a lecture on the economic realities of the modern world. He simply placed his fork down, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and pointed to the front door. He told her, in a voice devoid of inflection, that if she could not live in the real world and contribute to a sensible household, she could not live under his roof. He would not subsidize foolishness. Clara did not argue. She walked upstairs to her bedroom and packed her canvas duffel bag in exactly 10 minutes. She took 3 changes of sturdy clothing, a heavy wool sweater she had knit herself, a pair of thick socks, and her toothbrush. From beneath the mattress she retrieved the small rusted fabric snips and dropped them into the bottom of the bag. She walked back down the stairs, past the dining room where her parents remained seated in stone-faced silence, and stepped out into the sultry summer night. She did not look back. For the next 6 weeks, Clara was entirely homeless. She drifted through the hard concrete landscape of Albany, learning the brutal mathematics of survival on the street. The world, she quickly discovered, was loud, fast, and fiercely indifferent to a solitary 18-year-old girl carrying a canvas bag. She learned to sleep in the fluorescent buzzing glare of the Greyhound bus station waiting rooms, keeping her chin tucked to her chest to avoid the gaze of the security guard. She learned Verkehrtikehet public park benches were shielded from the wind, and which diner waitresses would allow her to sit with a single 10-cent cup of black coffee for 3 hours without demanding she. She learned to make herself completely invisible. She tied her hair back severely, wore her heavy wool sweater despite the lingering late summer heat, and slept with one arm wrapped in a tight, unyielding knot through the thick canvas straps of her duffel bag. Her meagre savings, scraped together from childhood birthday envelopes and rare allowances, dwindled with terrifying speed. Hunger transitioned from a sharp, urgent pain to a constant, dull ache that lived permanently in the hollow space beneath her ribs. Eventually, she was down to a handful of copper pennies and a single crumpled $2 bill she kept folded tightly inside her left shoe. It was on a Tuesday morning, seeking refuge from a sudden driving autumn downpour, that she wandered into the downtown public library. The building smelled of old paper, damp wool coats, and floor wax, a scent that momentarily reminded her of the row house she had left behind. She bypassed the fiction aisles and sat at a heavy oak table in the periodicals room, pretending to read so the librarians would not ask her to move along. She stared blankly at the classified section of a regional newspaper from the neighboring county, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The columns of text blurred together. A grey wall of jobs she did not want and apartments she could not afford. but then her eyes snagged on a tiny, two-line advertisement buried near the very bottom of the page. In the legal notices section, for tax sale, delinquent commercial property. Troy. Parcel Boncham High. Former millinery. Back taxes, high cum dola. Must claim in person. It was clearly a clerical error, a forgotten fraction of a county ledger, a ghost in the municipal records. The county of Rensselaer was likely clearing out decades of dead paperwork. But Clara saw the word millinery. She reached into her pocket and touched the cold metal of the rusted snip. She had exactly $2. The rain lashed heavily against the tall library windows, rattling the glass in its panes. But for the first time in her entire life, Clara Bowden felt the strange, terrifying, undeniable pull of a destination. She stood up, shouldered her heavy canvas bag, and walked back out into the storm. The journey north from Albany took the better part of 2 days. The commuter bus fare to the county line cost her 85 cents, leaving her with a handful of dimes and the sacred $2 bill still tucked inside her shoe. When the bus driver announced the end of the route, Clara stepped off onto the gravel shoulder of State Route Sheen. The air here was noticeably different from the city, sharper, carrying the distinct metallic chill of an upstate New York autumn. The sugar maples lining the highway had already begun their turn, the leaves burning in deep shades of crimson and burnt orange against the slate-grey sky. She walked the remaining 11 miles along the uneven shoulder of the highway. Cars passed her occasionally, their tires hissing on the damp asphalt, but no one stopped, and Clara did not extend her thumb to ask. She preferred the steady, rhythmic measure of her own pace. As evening fell and the temperature dropped into the low 40s, she sought shelter in a sagging, open-sided hay barn set back from a harvested cornfield. She curled into the far corner, wrapping her heavy wool sweater tightly around her shoulders, her duffel bag serving as a rigid pillow. The cold was a physical weight, settling deep into her bones, but it was an honest cold. It did not carry the suffocating pressure of her father's house. She slept in brief, shivering intervals, listening to the wind rattle the loose tin on the barn roof. She began walking again before dawn, her muscles stiff and her joints aching from the damp earth. By mid-morning the landscape began to shift. The open fields gave way to dense clusters of modest houses, and the road widened as it descended toward the Hudson River. She had reached Troy, a working-class city built on a foundation of river trade, textiles, and iron. It was a place constructed entirely of heavy, dark red brick, a town that felt substantial and heavily anchored to the earth. Clara walked down the main thoroughfare, taking careful inventory of her new surroundings. The sidewalks were cracked but swept clean. She passed a narrow Greek diner that exhaled a thick, comforting cloud of fried onions and strong coffee, a heavy timbered hardware store with galvanized buckets stacked neatly by the entrance, an immense silent textile mill with half its upper windows boarded over, a mobile service station smelling sharply of gasoline and wet rubber, and an independent corner pharmacy with a faded wooden mortar and pestle hanging above the door. It was a town that had clearly seen more prosperous decades, a place that was settling slowly into a quiet endurance. She followed the road signs toward the center town, finally locating the Rensselaer County Municipal Building. It was an imposing structure of grey limestone, fronted by a set of wide, steep steps. Clara paused at the bottom, suddenly acutely aware of her wrinkled skirt, her damp wool sweater, and the dirt under her fingernails. She knelt down, untied her left shoe, and carefully extracted the crumpled $2 bill. She smoothed it flat against her thigh, pressing the creases out with the palm of her hand. She took a deep breath, gripped the heavy brass handrail, which had been polished smooth by a century of anxious hands, and climbed the steps. Inside the building was a labyrinth of echoing marble hallways and frosted glass doors. The air was warm, heated by cast-iron radiators that clanked and hissed rhythmically in the corners. It smelled deeply of old floor wax, damp wool coats, and the sharp, distinctive tang of carbon paint. Clara navigated the corridors until she found a wooden door bearing the gold leaf stenciling of the county clerk's office. She pushed it open and stepped into a room dominated by a long, waist-high oak counter. Behind the counter stood a wall of towering metal filing cabinets and a sea of cluttered desks. She approached the counter slowly. Behind the polished wood sat a woman of formidable posture, peering down at a ledger. The clerk wore heavy tortoiseshell glasses attached to a beaded chain that rested against the collar of a sensible grey blouse. A small engraved brass nameplate on the counter identified her as Mrs. Abernathy. She did not look up immediately, allowing the scratch of her fountain pen to echo in the quiet room for a full minute before she finally capped the ink and raised her head. "Can Mott help you?" Mrs. Abernathy asked. Her voice carried the flat, unhurried cadence of the region, a tone that did not invite casual conversation. "Mottam here about a property listed in the tax sale," Clara said. Her voice wavered slightly, and she cleared her throat to steady it. "Parcel Bonecham High. The former millinery." Mrs. Abernathy adjusted her glasses, studying the young, dishevelled girl standing before her. She sighed a slow exhalation of bureaucratic fatigue and pulled a heavy canvas-bound ledger from a lower shelf. She flipped through the thick yellowed pages until she reached the correct entry. She traced a manicured finger down the column of faded ink. "Parcel Bonecham High, Mrs." Abernathy read aloud. "Located on River Alley. It has been vacant since Mortneen Cheen born me to. The back taxes are $2. But before we proceed, there are certain disclosures Mortam required by the county to provide." "Mott understand," Clara said softly. "Mrs." Abernathy looked over the rim of her glasses. "You understand that this property is currently condemned? You understand that there is no running water. The electrical wiring was severed 20 years ago, and the roof is severely compromised. And you understand, Mrs." Abernathy continued, leaning forward slightly, that the county has scheduled the structure for demolition in the spring if it is not brought up to commercial code by March 1st. If you buy it, you are buying the responsibility of tearing it down unless you can perform a miracle. "Yes, ma'am," Clara repeated. Her hand tightened around the smoothed $2 bill in her pocket. "Mort would like to purchase it. Please." "Mrs." Abernathy studied her for a long, silent moment. She pulled a stack of triplicate forms from a drawer and aligned them perfectly on the oak counter. She handed Clara a fountain pen. "Sign the bottom line on all 3 copies. Print your full legal name beneath the signature." Clara took the pen. Her hand shook slightly as she pressed the nib to the paper. She signed her name, careful to keep the ink from blotting, and printed Clara Bowden in neat block letters below it. "Mrs." Abernathy took the forms back, inspecting the signature. She paused. The ledger remained open on her desk, but her eyes fixed on the printed name. "Bowden," she said quietly. "Any relation to Beatrice Bowden? The seamstress down in Albany?" Clara stiffened. The mention of her great-aunt in this municipal office felt like an intrusion. a sudden breach in the armour she had carefully constructed over the past 6 weeks. She nodded slowly. She was my great-aunt. The severe lines around Mrs. Abernathy's mouth softened. Just a fraction. She reached up and touched the beaded chain of her glasses. She made my wedding veil in Morningsheen Barmy High, the clerk said softly. It was made of Brussels lace. Finest needlework Mutt ever saw in my life. The woman had a gift. Clara felt a sudden, fierce constriction in her throat. She did not trust herself to speak, so she simply placed the worn $2 bill onto the oak counter. Mrs. Abernathy looked at the money, then looked at Clara. She did not ask why the niece of the finest seamstress in Albany was buying a condemned building with a shoe-creased bill. She simply opened a drawer, produced a heavy brass stamp, and brought it down hard on the triplicate form. The loud, decisive thud echoed off the marble floors. It was the sound of an official transfer, the sound of a closing ledger. She handed Clara the yellow carbon copy, a receipt, and a heavy rusted iron key. River Alley is 3 blocks west, Mrs. Abernathy said. It sits behind the old brickworks. May the Lord watch over you. Clara Bowden. Clara stepped back out into the sharp autumn air. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks dark and slick. She walked 3 blocks west, navigating the uneven brick pavement, the heavy iron key a cold, solid weight in the pocket of her wool sweater. She turned off the main street and entered River Alley, a narrow, shadowed cobblestone passage that smelled of wet brick and river mud. A stray yellow dog watched her warily from beneath a rusted fire escape before trotting away into the gloom. An elderly man sweeping the stoop of a back-alley bakery paused to lean on his broom, observing the stranger, but he did not speak. She walked past a row of shuttered warehouses, her boots scuffing against the damp cobblestones, until she reached the end of the alley. There, wedged tightly between the towering, blank wall of the old brickworks and a vacant lot overgrown with invasive sumac, stood Parcel Bonchen High. It was a narrow 2-story structure constructed of deep, dark red brick, built in a vernacular style that prioritized function over ornament. The brickwork was heavily weathered, the mortar crumbling to white dust in the joints. Above the boarded-up display windows, a faded, peeling-painted sign spanned the width of the facade. The black lettering had been severely battered by decades of wind and rain, but Clara could still trace the ghost of the words, E. Vance, Millinery and Fine Goods. The building was a ruin. The cornice sagging above the second-story windows warned of catastrophic structural failure. The heavy pine boards covering the storefront were warped, black with rot, and covered in layers of peeling wheat paste post. But as Clara stood in the damp alleyway, staring up at the dilapidated brick facade, she did not see a condemned liability. She saw a fortress. She approached the heavy oak front door, which was deeply recessed into a shadowy alcove. The wood was splintered at the base, and the brass doorknob was black with tarnish. Clara retrieved the rusted iron key from her pocket. She slid it into the keyhole. It resisted for a moment the internal tumblers seized by years of rust and disuse, but she applied steady, deliberate pressure until the lock gave way with a heavy, metallic groan. She turned the knob and the door dragged heavily against the warped floorboards, protesting loudly as she forced it open. Clara stepped inside. The air in the front showroom was dense and utterly still, untouched by the outside world since Morningsheen Bon Mwy II. It smelled profoundly of dry rot, settled plaster dust, and the faint, sweet, unmistakable scent of old wool felt. The only light filtered in through the narrow cracks between the boards over the windows, casting thin, dusty beams across the room. The space was completely empty of furniture. stripped down to the bare, water-stained pine floorboards and the peeling floral wallpaper that hung in long, tragic strips from the plaster wall. She walked slowly through the front room, her footsteps echoing sharply in the cavernous silence, and passed through a narrow archway into the back workroom. Here, the darkness was nearly absolute. She could barely make out the shape of a massive brick chimney rising up the centre of the wall, and the outline of a narrow, steep staircase leading to the second floor. The floorboards in the workroom felt soft and untrustworthy beneath her boots, giving slightly with each step. Clara did not explore further. The exhaustion of the past 6 weeks, the miles of walking, the cold nights on the concrete, and the sheer adrenaline of the purchase finally collapsed upon her in a crushing wave. She retreated to the front showroom, where the floor felt most solid. She set her canvas duffel bay agur down in the corner, farthest from the drafty door. She did not have a broom to sweep the floor, nor a blanket to soften the hard pine boards. She simply pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms tightly around her legs, and laid her head upon her canvas bag. The building was freezing, the air thick with the smell of decay, and she was entirely alone. But as she closed her eyes, the silence of the shop did not feel oppressive. It felt protected. Some places are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. As Clara lay on her canvas bag that first night, the absolute silence of the abandoned shop eventually gave way to the subtle, deeper sounds of the dying town. Troy was a city that did not sleep so much as it exhausted itself. Through the thin, cracked boards over the front windows, she could hear the distant, heavy rumble of a midnight freight train moving slowly along the eastern bank of the Hudson. The low vibration travelled up through the earth, passing into the deep brick foundation of the shop and vibrating softly through the pine floorboards beneath her shoulders. It was a comforting rhythm, a reminder that the world continued to turn even if she had stepped out of its primary current. She turned her head, looking toward the solid, towering wall of the brickworks that dominated the alley directly adjacent to her shop. The massive factory had once employed half the able-bodied men in Rensselaer County. Its kilns had fired the very bricks that sheltered her now, baking the river clay at 3,000 degrees until it turned hard and impervious to the weather. Now the brickworks stood entirely silent, its towering smokestacks cold and empty against the night sky. The industry that had built the town had moved on, leaving behind these massive architectural ghosts. Clara felt a profound, overwhelming sense of being entirely unmoored, cut completely loose from the rigid schedule of the Albany row house, the clattering typewriter, and her father's suffocating expectations. Yet, lying on the dusty, freezing floor of a condemned building she legally owned, she felt more grounded than she had ever felt in her entire life. The cold began to creep through the floorboards as the ambient temperature outside dropped below freezing. She reached into her shoe, retrieved her small handful of change, and counted the copper pennies in the absolute dark by touch alone. She had exactly 85 cents remaining to her name. It was terrifying, but it was a terror entirely of her own making, and that simple fact made it bearable. The first 3 days in the shop were an education in the architecture of neglect. Clara did not attempt to clean or clear the debris. She simply observed. She learned the specific language of She learned that the floorboards near the boarded-up front windows sagged dangerously, the wood spongy with rot, but the planks surrounding the massive central chimney remained solid and true. She learned that the wind sweeping off the Hudson River found its way through a dozen unseen cracks in the mortar, causing the peeling wallpaper to rustle continuously like dry autumn leaves. In the small, walled backyard, a narrow patch of earth choked with invasive sumac and broken glass. She made 2 critical discoveries. The first was a leaning wooden outhouse that, while missing half its roof shingles, was structurally sound enough to use. The second was a rusted cast-iron hand pump standing rigidly in the centre of the weeds. On her second morning, Clara used a tin cup to gather rainwater from a puddle, poured it down the top of the iron casing to prime the leather gasket, and threw her entire weight onto the heavy iron handle. It resisted violently, shrieking in protest, but after 10 minutes of exhausted pumping, a stream of freezing, metallic-tasting groundwater burst from the spout. She drank until her stomach ached, the cold water shocking her system into sharp focus. But water and shelter were not enough. The temperature inside the brick building dropped precipitously when the sun went down, hovering just a few degrees above freezing. She needed fire, and she needed tools to safely clear the chimney. She also needed food. On the afternoon of the third day, Clara walked back down River Alley and entered the heavy timbered hardware store she had noted upon her arrival. The interior smelled of linseed oil, fertilizer, and cut pine. Behind the counter stood a man with a shock of thick white hair and a canvas apron stained with varnish. His hands, resting on the glass counter, were heavily calloused, the knuckles thick and gnarled from decades of manual labor. He watched her approach, taking in the soot on her wool sweater and the dark circles beneath her eyes. "You re the girl," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The one who bought the old Vance place out of the tax ledger." "Yes, sir," Clara said. "Mort met Mr. Henderson," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mott Vey been on this street for 40 years. Everybody thought the county was just going to let that brick pile collapse into the alley." "Mott am going to fix it," Clara said quietly. "Mr. Henderson raised a thick white eyebrow, looking her up and down. He did not laugh, nor did he offer pity, which Clara appreciated more than anything. "That is a tall order for one pair of hands," he noted. "Mott do not have any money," Clara stated, holding his gaze evenly, refusing to let her voice tremble. "Mott spent my last $2 on the deed, but Mott am not afraid of heavy work. If you will extend me a line of credit for some basic supplies, Mott will sweep your floors, unload your trucks, or clean your windows every morning before you open until the debt is paid." Mr. Henderson studied her for a long, silent minute. The store was quiet, save for the slow ticking of a wall clock. Finally, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He opened it to a blank page, dipped a pen in an inkwell, and wrote Clara Bowden, parcel Boncham High at the top. "Mott don't need my floors swept, mister," Henderson said gruffly. "But Mott needs someone to restock the lumber racks out back on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. It is heavy, dirty work." "Mott will be here," Clara said. Mr. Henderson nodded once. He reached under the counter again and pulled out a thick worn book with a cracked leather spine. He pushed it across the glass toward her. "Take this too. It belonged to my older brother. He was a carpenter, passed on 5 years ago. It's a manual on structural repair. If you are going to keep that roof from falling on your head, you had better know the difference between a load-bearing joist and a lath wall." Clara touched the cracked leather cover. The weight of the small kindness settled heavily in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "Don't thank me yet," he grunted. "Wait until you see how heavy the oak planks are on Tuesday. Now, tell me what you need." Clara walked out of the hardware store an hour later carrying a galvanized steel bucket filled with specific, essential supplies. She had been meticulous, calculating the cost of every item as Mr. Henderson wrote it down in the ledger. A stiff, bristled steel wire brush kong chum bo num dola, a narrow masonry trowel mort chumot num dola, a heavy canvas drop cloth mort chum num cum dola, a box of wooden matches cum chum cum num dola, From the small grocer next door, she had added a 2-pound canvas bag of rolled oats $1 and a small tin of Morton salt $1. Her total debt stood Art Mortfay exactly $3.30. It was a terrifying sum, but it was the price of survival. She returned to the shop and immediately went to work on the massive brick chimney in the back workroom. It was the heart of the building, a wide, deep firebox designed to heat the entire structure, but the flue was completely choked. Armed with the steel wire brush and the masonry trowel, Clara crawled head and shoulders into the dark, freezing firebox. The work was brutal, suffocating, and entirely necessary. Decades of dried leaves, collapsed bird nests, and crumbling mortar rained down upon her as she scraped blindly upward. Beneath the debris lay a thick, hardened layer of creosote, a highly flammable glass-like tar that had to be removed before a fire could be safely lit. She worked for 7 hours without stopping. The muscles in her shoulders burned and her knuckles bled from repeatedly striking the rough brick. The black, powdery soot coated her hair, worked its way under her fingernails, and filled her lungs, making her cough violently. By the time the flue was finally clear, allowing a faint, grey square of twilight to be visible at the very top of the chimney, Clara was exhausted to the point of trembling. But the chimney was safe. She gathered broken pieces of pine lath from the ruined walls, stripping away the old plaster, and built a careful, cross-hatched pile in the centre of the swept firebox. She struck one of the wooden matches against the brick. The flame flared bright yellow in the gloom. She touched it to a twist of old newspaper she had found in the alley. The paper caught, curling into black ash, and the dry pine lath followed instantly. The fire cracked loudly, a sharp, aggressive sound in the silent building. Clara held her breath, watching the smoke. The draft caught perfectly, pulling the grey plume straight up the freshly cleared flue. She did not move for a long time. She sat on the cold floorboards, as close to the firebox as she dared, letting the intense, radiant heat bake into her shivering body. It was the first true warmth she had felt in 6 weeks. When the fire burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, she filled the galvanized bucket vase kepi te hat water from the yard pump, set it securely on the hot bricks, and poured in a handful of rolled oats and a pinch of salt. She ate the boiled oats directly from the bucket using a piece of clean wood as a spoon. It tasted of smoke, iron, and salt, but it was the finest meal she had ever consumed. She slept that night curled beside the warm brick of the chimney, the deep, heavy sleep of someone who has finally secured a foothold on the... The next morning, fortified by the residual warmth of the bricks and another meagre portion of oats, Clara began a methodical inventory of the back workroom. The space had clearly been the operational heart of Eleanor Vance's business. Unlike the empty front showroom, this room was cluttered with the heavy, immobile fixtures of the millinery trade. There were 3 massive oak work tables, their surfaces scarred by awls and stained with dye. Beneath the tables sat a dozen wooden hat blocks, crowns and brims of various circumferences, carved from maple and pine, though most were severely warped from the ambient dampness of the building. Clara moved methodically, examining every shadow. She found spools of cotton thread that disintegrated into dust when touched, and several rusted wire hat frames that crumbled like dead leaves. She was cataloguing the decay, understanding what could be saved and what had to be discarded. It was during this slow, deliberate inspection that she noticed the anomaly on the heaviest of the 3 work tables, positioned directly beneath a narrow, high window. Tuesday morning arrived with a brutal, biting frost. Clara honoured her debt to Mr. Henderson by reporting to the heavy-timbered hardware store exactly at 6 o'clock in the morning, before the sun had even cleared the rooflines of Troy. The heavy flatbed delivery truck arrived 10 minutes later, groaning under the weight of raw timber sourced from the pine forests further north. Mr. Henderson emerged from the store wearing his canvas apron and handed Clara a pair of thick, stiff leather work gloves. He did not ask if she was strong enough. He simply pointed to the back of the flat. The physical labor was grueling, demanding a kind of raw, explosive energy Clara had never before been required to summon. She spent 3 hours offloading massive 16-foot 2x4s and heavy rough-sawn oak planks, carrying them on her shoulder from the truck to the covered lumber racks behind the store. The rough wood bit through the leather gloves, splintering and tearing at the flesh of her palm. The older men working in the lumber yard, hardened veterans of the river trade, stopped to watch her, expecting the slender 18-year-old girl to drop the timber or quit after the first hour. But Clara did not. She locked her jaw, found the center of gravity in each heavy board, and moved with a silent, relentless determination that eventually silenced the murmurs of the yard hand. Mr. Henderson observed her quietly from the loading dock, a clipboard in his hand. When the final oak plank was securely stacked on the rack, Clara stood in the yard, her chest heaving, her wool sweater soaked verkepite hat cold sweat despite the freezing temperature. Mr. Henderson walked over, took the leather gloves from her trembling hands, and marked a heavy black line through her name in his ledger book. He then handed her 2 silver quarters. "You earned an extra 50 cents in store credit today," he said gruffly. The yard hands usually take twice as long to clear a load that size. Clara took the coins. Her muscles ached fiercely, and her shoulders burned with a deep lactic fire. But she felt a profound surge of independence. She used the 50 cents immediately, purchasing a heavy bar of harsh lye soap and a small cast-iron skillet. She would no longer have to boil her oats in the galvanized bucket, and she could finally wash the soot from her face. She walked back down River Alley, her arms aching, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of her own survival in her pocket. Resting exactly in the center of the heavy oak table was a hat block unlike any of the others scattered on the floor. It was massive, a deeply curved crown block designed for shaping wide, structured brims, carved from a single, flawless piece of solid heartwood oak. Unlike the other blocks in the room, which had suffered terribly from the damp, this piece of wood remained pristine, its surface smooth and darkly polished, seemingly impervious to the rot that had claimed the rest of the shop. Clara approached the table, wiping her soot-stained hands on her skirt before reaching out to touch it. She placed her palms against the curved wood and attempted to slide it closer to the edge of the table to examine it in the dim light. It did not move. She pushed harder, digging her boots into the floorboards for leverage. The block remained entirely stationary. She bent down, inspecting the base, and realized it was not simply resting on the table. It had been secured from beneath, pinned tightly to the thick oak planks. Frowning, Clara straightened up. It was unusual to bolt a hat block to a table. Milliners needed to move the blocks freely to view the drape of the fabric from all angles. She tapped the side of the curved oak with her knuckle, expecting the dull, dead, unresponsive thud of solid, dense heartwood. The sound that echoed back was sharp, resonant, hollow. Clara froze. The silence of the old shop rushed back in, broken only by the distant drip of condensation. She tapped the block again, harder this time. The hollow acoustic signature was undeniable. The massive piece of oak was not solid. It had been expertly cored out. She fell to her knees, pressing her face close to the heavy planks of the work table, running her fingertips along the exact circumference where the base of the oak block met the table surface. At first she felt nothing but a smooth transition. But as she traced the back edge, the side facing the brick wall, her fingernail caught on a microscopic ridge. It was a hairline seam, nearly invisible to the eye, following the curve of the wall. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm. She reached into her pocket and retrieved the small, rusted fabric snips she had carried from Beatrice's attic. She carefully inserted the sharp, pointed tip of the metal blades into the hairline seam. She applied a slow, steady, deliberate downward pressure, terrified the brittle metal of the snips would. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wood held its secret tightly. But then, with a sharp, dry crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room, a circular disc of cedar wood popped loose from the bottom of the block, dropping freely into Clara's waiting hand. The disc had been pressure-fitted, perfectly cut to seal a deep, hollow cylindrical cavity carved upward into the center of the massive oak crown. Clara set the cedar disc on the floor. Her hands were shaking so severely she had to press them flat against her thighs to steady them. She took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust and the old wool, and reached her hand up into the dark, hollow belly of the wooden hat block. Her fingers brushed against something soft, something wrapped tightly in fabric. She grasped the object and pulled it downward, easing it carefully through the circular opening. It was a heavy bundle, wrapped meticulously in yards of deep, midnight blue silk ribbon. The ribbon was thick and luxurious, the kind of material Clara had only ever seen locked inside glass display cases in the finest department stores in Albany. She set the bundle gently on the work table. She reached into the cavity a second time. She withdrew another bundle, similarly wrapped in silk, though this one felt solid and metallic beneath the fabric. She reached in a third time, her arm buried up to the elbow. Her fingers scraped against cold metal. She gripped the edge of the object and pulled. It was a heavy, rectangular tin biscuit box, the lid sealed tight with a thick layer of yellowed wax. Clara stood back from the table, staring at the three items resting in the dusty light. The shop was absolutely silent. She did not know what she had found, but she knew, with the innate certainty of someone who has survived by reading the quiet signs of the world, that the woman who had owned this shop had not abandoned these things by accident. They had been intentionally, desperately preserved. Clara approached the table. She untied the heavy silk ribbon of the first bundle, her fingers clumsy with anticipation. The fabric fell away to reveal a collection of heirloom millinery tools. There was a polished bone folder, its edges worn smooth by decades of friction against stiff felt. Beside it lay a heavy brass thimble, deeply engraved with a trailing ivy pattern, and a small leather pouch containing a set of specialized hand-forged needles that gleamed sharply in the dim light, entirely untouched by rust. They were the tools of a master, the physical extension of a craftswoman's hand. She opened the second bundle. It contained raw material, 2 flawless, continuous yards of midnight blue velvet. It was a fabric of profound depth, so dense and perfectly preserved it seemed to absorb the light in the room. It had been protected from the damp, the moths, and the rot by the airtight seal of the oak block. It was breathtaking. Finally, Clara turned her attention to the heavy tin biscuit box. She used the edge of her rusted snips to carefully scrape away the thick layer of yellowed wax sealing the lid. She wedged the blades under the rim and pried upward. The tin lid popped off with a metallic groan. Clara looked inside, and the breath left her lungs in a single, sharp exhale. The box was packed, edge to edge, with tight, rubber-banded stacks of paper currency. She did not touch it immediately. She stared at the green ink, the faces of presidents, staring back at her from the depths of the Her mind, conditioned by 6 weeks of agonizing over copper pennies and calculating the exact cost of a cup of black coffee, simply refused to process the visual information. She carefully lifted the box, carried it to the floor near the warmth of the brick chimney, and sat down. Methodically, with hands that had finally stopped shaking, Clara began to pull the bundles out, breaking the brittle, rotted rubber bands and laying the bills flat on the pine floorboard. There were thick stacks of $20 bills, heavy bundles of 50s, and crisp, older series $100 bills. She counted with slow, precise deliberation, moving the bills from one pile to another, whispering the numbers aloud to anchor herself to reality. She counted the paper money 3 times. The total was exactly $36,000. At the very bottom of the tin box, resting beneath a false cardboard floor, she found a small canvas coin purse. She dumped the contents into her palm. There was $42 in loose bills and 85 cents in coins, including a silver Walking Liberty $half and a steel penny dated Morningshin Bommi Ba. 36,000. $42 and 85 cents. Beside the coin purse lay 2 final items. The first was a small velvet-lined jeweler S-box. Clara opened it to find a Purple Heart medal, the heavy gold heart bearing the profile of George Washington, suspended from a purple and white ribbon. Engraved on the back, in precise shallow lettering, was a name and a year, Thomas Vance, Morningshin born me too. The second item was a letter, written on thick, cream-coloured stationery, folded perfectly into thirds. Clara set the medal gently down next to the towering stacks of currency. She looked at the folded letter, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges but otherwise pristine. She knew without question that the words written on that page contained the entire weight of this room, the explanation for the money, the tools, the medal, and the 24 years of silence. But her mind was reeling, oversaturated and fragile. She could not read it. Not yet. She carefully placed the money, the tools, the velvet, the medal, and the unread letter back into the tin box. She fitted the lid tightly back into place and pushed the box deep into the corner beside her canvas duffel bag. Clara stood up. The air in the shop felt too thick, too heavily charged. She walked to the back door, worked the rusted deadbolt free, and stepped out into the freezing night air of the alley. She walked to the end of the brick wall and stared out toward the heavy dark expanse of the Hudson River. The water moved with a slow muscular power, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out on its banks. She stood there in the bitter cold, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, listening to the water churn against the concrete pilings, waiting for the safety of daylight before she dared to open the letter. Some places are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. Morning arrived not as a sudden breaking of light, but as a slow grey thinning of the shadows inside the shop. Clara had not slept since discovering the tin box. She had spent the remainder of the night sitting on the floorboards, her back resting against the warm brick of the chimney, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards over the front window. When the daylight finally filtered through the narrow gaps in the pine, casting pale, dusty stripes across the floor, she reached into the tin box and retrieved the folded letter. She carried it to the front showroom, where the light was strongest. Her hands were clean, scrubbed raw with a rag and cold water from the pump, out of an instinctive respect for the document. She unfolded the thick, cream-coloured stationery. The paper crackled slightly, stiff with age and the cold. The ink was a faded sepia-toned black. Clara immediately recognized the style of the handwriting. It was an elegant, sweeping Spencerian script. The letters formed ve capite het exact, measured loops and sharp, deliberate angles. It was identical to the handwriting her great-aunt Beatrice had used to record measurements in her ledgers. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught in an era that equated penmanship with moral character. a woman who valued precision above all else. Clara took a slow breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and began to read. My dear one, whoever you are, Mort am writing this letter on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The shop is quiet. It has been quiet for many months. Dr. Elias Thorne, a specialist down in Albany, has informed me that the rheumatoid arthritis in my hands will soon fuse my joints entirely. He also confirmed what Mott have suspected for a year. The macular degeneration will take the remainder of my sight before the first heavy snow of winter. My hands and my eyes are my livelihood, my connection to the physical world, and they are leaving. Mort have spent the morning securing this block, sealing away the finest tools Mort possess. This shop was built by my father, William Vance, in Morteen Tam Chin Hai, using bricks fired from the clay of the Hudson River. But our trade goes back further. His mother, Mary Vance, carried the fundamental tools of this craft across the ocean from County Cork, Ireland, in Morteen Tam Bon Mi Lam. She survived the crossing and the fever to sew heavy wool bonnets in the suffocating heat of a New York tenement, saving copper pennies in a jar until she could afford passage north. We have always worked with our hands. We have always believed that a well-made garment is a form of armor. But armor cannot protect you from everything. Mort closed the doors of this shop for the final time on the morning of June Tam, Morteen Chin Bo Mi Tu. That was 2 days after the telegram arrived from the War Department. My only son, Thomas, fell on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June. He was 21 years old. He had my hands, long-fingered and steady, and he was meant to take over the ledger when Mott could no longer see the... When Thomas died, the colour went out of the world. Moot could no longer bear to work with the bright silks and the rich velvets. Moot sealed this block and left the shop to the silence. 24 years have passed since that day, or perhaps more by the time you find this. Mott could not bear to sell the building to strangers who would tear it down, nor could Mott bear to stand in this room and work without him. So Mott simply locked the door and walked away. Clara did not move to put the letter away immediately. Instead, she held the thick, cream-coloured stationery up to the dusty light filtering through the boards, examining the physical construction of the page. Beneath the sweeping, faded black ink, she could clearly see the faint, translucent ghost of a watermark woven deep into the fibres of the paper, a stylized eagle carrying a bundle of arrows. It was heavy, expensive cotton go paper, the kind of material that was designed specifically to endure, intended to outlast the person who wrote upon it. She gently traced the outline of the signature with the tip of her index finger, feeling the microscopic indentations where the steel nib of Eleanor Vance's fountain pen had pressed firmly into the page. Clara closed her eyes, imagining the woman sitting in this exact room 24 years. She imagined Eleanor's hands, swollen, painful, the joints fusing together vecepite hat relentless arthritis, gripping the barrel of the pen with sheer, stubborn willpower. She imagined the fading eyesight, the terrible dimming of the world, and the immense crushing grief of losing an only son to a distant beach in Normandy. It was a profound and sobering realization. While Clara had spent her childhood in Albany, being relentlessly pressured to conform, forced to sit at a black cast-iron typewriter and learn a trade designed to make her invisible, Eleanor Vance had been standing in this room, fiercely holding the line for a craft that the modern world was rapidly discarding. Eleanor had refused to surrender to the era of mass production and cheap disposable goods. She had recognized that true value lay in the slow, deliberate work of human hands, and she had fought to preserve that legacy until her body simply refused to carry the burden any longer. The letter was not just an explanation. It was a quiet rebellion. It was a refusal to let the trade die in silence. As Clara sat on the floorboards, holding the heavy paper, she understood that the world possessed a terrible, unthinking habit of discarding things too quickly, discarding heavy oak hat blocks, discarding the skills of the past, and discarding observant girls who did not fit into predetermined columns. But Eleanor Vance had understood the value of preservation. She had carefully boxed her life-s work, sealed it away in the heart of a solid oak block, and trusted that eventually someone would come along who knew how to look beneath the surface. Clara realized with a sudden, fierce clarity that she was no longer merely a runaway seeking shelter. She had been chosen. But Mott could not let the trade die entirely. If you have found this, if you have possessed the intuition to seek out the hollow space in the wood, and the patience to pry it open, then perhaps you are the one Mott have been waiting for. If you are to take up these tools, you must understand the material, and you must respect the physical laws of the craft. True beaver felt is stubborn. It requires steam at precisely high degrees, no less, or the interlocking fibers will not relax enough to take a new shape. When you are sizing the felt, use a ratio of exactly 1 part natural lac to 3 parts denatured alcohol. Do not rush the blocking process. The wooden block must be warmed near the stove before the damp felt is applied. If you pull hot felt over cold wood, the crown will warp upon cooling and the tension will never hold. The needles Mott have left you are hand-forged English steel. They must be oiled lightly with mineral oil every month, or the dampness of the river will rust them beyond use. These are the rules of the physical world. The rules of the spirit are harder to articulate. Mott have come to understand that we do not truly own anything in this world, my dear one. We are only temporary stewards of the tools, keeping them sharp and true until the next pair of hands requires them. We do not own the buildings we inhabit, and we do not own the people we love. We are merely given the privilege of holding them for a brief, brightly lit moment in time. The money Mott leave you in this box is not a gift. It is an inheritance of labour. It is the accumulated quiet work of 4 generations of men and women who stood at these tables until their backs ached and their eyes failed. Mott leave it to you so that you do not have to worry about the coal bill or the county tax assessor. Mott leave it so that you can afford the time it takes to learn the trade correctly. Do not rush the work. The building is strong. It will protect you while you learn. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor Vance. October Mirihai. Mortin Chin Bun Mi Tu. Clara stopped reading. The silence in the front showroom was absolute, but it no longer felt empty. The air felt charged, thick with the lingering echo of Eleanor Vance's grief and fierce, protective generosity. Clara read the letter a second time, her eyes moving slowly over the precise Spencerian loops, absorbing the technical instructions and the immense, crushing weight of the history contained within the tin box. When she finished the second reading, her hands were trembling again. She did not cry. She simply felt a profound, heavy settling in her chest, as if a vital piece of her own internal architecture had finally clicked securely into place. She folded the thick cream-coloured paper perfectly along its original 24-year-old creases. She walked back into the dim workroom, knelt beside her canvas bag, and placed the letter gently back into the tin box, resting it on top of the stacked currency and the purple heart. She closed the lid, pressing it down firmly. It was done. She was no longer a homeless 18-year-old girl hiding from the world. She was the steward of Parcel Bonline High. Clara stood up from the floor. Her muscles were stiff from the cold and the tension of the long night, but she moved with a new, deliberate purpose. She walked to the back door, slid the heavy iron deadbolt back, and stepped out into the enclosed yard. The morning air was biting, smelling of river water and impending frost. In a postscript at the very bottom of the page, below the signature, Eleanor Vance had written a single, final sentence. Mott buried Thomas' childhood pocket-knife beneath the lilac bush near the back brick wall, so a piece of him would always remain in the earth here. Clara walked across the frozen, weed-choked yard toward the towering back wall of the adjacent brickworks. There, in the deepest corner of the shadow, she found the gnarled, twisted roots of a massive, long-dead lilac bush. The branches were grey and brittle, snapping easily in the cold wind, but the root system remained firmly anchored in the soil. Clara knelt in the dirt. She did not dig for the knife. She felt it would be a violation to disturb the earth Eleanor had packed down 24 years ago. Instead, she placed her bare hand flat against the frozen ground above the roots, pressing her palm into the soil. She stayed there for several minutes, acknowledging the boy who had never returned from Normandy and the mother who had locked the door behind her. When she returned inside, the shop felt distinctly warmer, though the ambient temperature had not changed. She searched the lower cabinets of the work tables and found a heavy brass oil lantern coated in a thick layer of dust. The glass globe was intact. She wiped the glass clean with the hem of her sweater, filled the reservoir with a splash of kerosene she had purchased from Mr. Henderson the day before, and trimmed the hardened wick with her rusted snips. She struck a wooden match and touched it to the cotton. The flame caught immediately, burning with a bright, steady yellow light. Clara placed the lantern in the centre of the heavy oak work table, right beside the hollowed-out hat block. She pulled up a wooden stool and sat down, watching the flame. It did not flicker. The heavy brick walls of the shop blocked the wind entirely, providing absolute shelter. As she sat in the quiet, steady glow of the lantern, Clara thought about the invisible, fragile chain of events that had brought her to this exact chair. She thought of the librarian in Albany who had seen a shivering, exhausted girl in a damp wool sweater and had chosen to look away, allowing her to sit in the warm reading room for hours without demanding an address or a library card. She thought of Mrs. Abernathy, the severe county clerk whose entire demeanour had softened at the mere mention of Great-Aunt Beatrice S. name, honouring the memory of a beautifully constructed wedding veil by stamping a deed without asking difficult questions. She thought of Mr. Henderson, a man whose hands were scarred by a lifetime of hard labour, who had looked to Motfi, a destitute 18-year-old girl, and decided to hand her a leather-bound manual and a line of credit based on nothing but her promise to work. These were not grand, historical acts of heroism. They were small, quiet moments of human decency. But they were the structural load-bearing joists of her survival. Without any one of them, the chain would have broken, and she would have never reached this room. It is a strange and beautiful thing, the way the world can catch you when you are falling, often through the hands of people you will never meet again, a librarian who does not ask for your address, a clerk who softens at a name, a hardware store owner who extends credit to a stranger based on a quiet promise. These are not grand historical acts, but they are the quiet, invisible threads that hold our lives together and pull us toward the places we are meant to be. Before we continue, have you ever experienced a small kindness from a stranger that changed your path, or perhaps offered one yourself? Tell us in the comments below. These are the stories that remind us we are not alone. Clara watched the lantern burn for another hour, the heat from the glass warming her hands. Finally, exhaustion overcame her. She blew out the flame, letting the shop return to the grey light of morning. She walked over to her canvas duffel bag in the corner. From the work table she retrieved a polished bone folder and the heavy brass thimble, slipping them into the deep pockets of her wool sweater. She lay down on the hard pine floorboards, pulled her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes. Surrounded by the physical proof of her inheritance, and protected by the heavy brick walls Eleanor Vance had left behind, Clara Bowden slept deeply and without fear for the first time in her life. When Clara woke the following morning, the quality of the light filtering through the boarded windows had shifted. It was her first full day standing in the shop, not merely as a desperate runaway seeking temporary shelter, but as the recognized, intended steward of Parcel Bon. The heavy brass key sat quietly on the brick mantel, and the tin box rested securely in the corner, holding the weight of 4 generations of labor. She stood up, brushing the dust from her heavy wool sweater, and began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the back work. She ran her bare hand along the edge of the massive oak tables, feeling the deep, smooth grooves worn into the wood by decades of dragging heavy wool and stiff felt across the surface. She studied the rusted wire hat frames hanging from the wooden pegs on the wall, imagining the shapes they had once supported. Wide-brimmed summer hats trimmed with silk flowers, austere mourning veils, practical winter cloches designed to block the biting wind off them. She realized that the absolute silence of this room was fundamentally different from the silence she had endured in the narrow brick row house in Albany. The silence in her father's house had been a weapon, a tool of active suppression designed to extinguish any spark of individuality before it could catch fire. It was a dead, suffocating quiet. But the silence in the Milliner shop was entirely different. It was a living, expectant quiet. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a stage before the curtain rises, the silence of a heavy, solid structure patiently enduring the passage of time until the necessary elements return to set it back into motion. Eleanor Vance had not killed the shop when she locked the door in Mortneen Cheen Born Me Too. She had simply put it to sleep. And as Clara stood in the centre of the room, feeling the steady, resonant strength of the floorboards beneath her boots, she understood that her task was not to conquer the building, but to gently, methodically wake it up. She did not touch the $36,000. The temptation was immense. The money could have hired a crew of contractors to rebuild the shop in a month, could have bought her a warm hotel room, could have erased every physical hardship she faced. But Eleanor Vance had not left the money for a rapid, careless renovation. She had left it to ensure the trade survived. Clara understood, with a profound instinctive clarity, that if she paid someone else to repair the building, she would merely be a tenant in a restored space. To become the true steward of Parcel Bongen High, she had to earn the walls with her own hand. She took $50 from the tin box to cover immediate materials and locked the rest away. The roof was the most critical failure point. A building without a sound roof is merely a ruin waiting for permission to collapse. Clara sat at the heavy oak work table in the dim light of the lantern, using a torn brown paper grocery bag and a stub of pencil to calculate the geometry of the structure based on the formulas in Mr. Henderson's leather-bound manual. She calculated the pitch, the square footage, the number of architectural asphalt shingles, the rolls of heavyweight tar paper, and the linear feet of structural lumber required to sister the rotting rafters. When she presented the paper bag to Mr. Henderson at the hardware store, he studied the neat, precise mathematics for a long time. He did not question her math. He simply loaded the materials onto his flatbed delivery truck and drove them down River Alley himself. "The wood is heavy, Clara," he warned, standing in the alley and looking up at the sagging cornice. "You can lift a 16-foot structural beam by yourself." "Mort have leverage," Clara replied quietly. Mr. Henderson grunted, but he stayed for an hour. He showed her the precise mechanics of sistering a joist, bolting a new solid piece of dimensional lumber directly against the rotting original to transfer the structural load. He showed her how to use heavy steel carriage bolts, tightening the nuts with a massive iron wrench until the wood groaned and held. For the next 11 days, Clara lived on the roof. The wind sweeping off the Hudson River in November was a brutal, physical force carrying the bitter chill of impending snow. She worked systematically, stripping away the rotted shingles and the black, decayed tar paper down to the bare wooden deck. She sistered 6 compromised rafters, hauling the heavy pine beams up a wooden ladder one agonizing rung at a time, using ropes and mechanical leverage just as the manual dictated. Once the structure was secure, she unrolled the new tar paper, overlapping the seams exactly 4 inches, securing it with galvanized roofing tacks. She learned to snap a blue chalk line across the black paper, ensuring the courses of shingles remained perfectly parallel to the eave. The work demanded a harsh, rhythmic physical exertion. She learned to drive a heavy roofing nail with exactly 3 strokes of a framing hammer, one to set, one to drive, one to sink. By the end of the 11th day, her shoulders were heavily bruised, her hands were calloused and split from the cold, but the roof was watertight. When the first heavy freezing rain of the season fell that night, Clara lay on her canvas bag and listened to the water drum against the new shingles. Not a single drop breached the ceiling. On the 9th day of the roof repair, the environment tested her structural limits. A sudden, violent November gale swept aggressively up the Hudson River Valley, bringing with it a driving, freezing rain that turned to sleet upon impact. Clara was pinned on the pitched roof, clinging desperately to the newly sistered rafters as the wind howled around the chimney, threatening to tear the heavy black tar paper clean away before she could secure it. The sheer physical terror of the height was paralyzing. She was suspended 20 feet above the hard cobblestones of the alley, with nothing but the friction of her boots on the wet decking keeping her from a fatal fall. The freezing rain lashed against her face, blinding her and turning her fingers into numb, useless appendages. Every instinct screamed at her to drop her tools, scramble back down the ladder, and seek the safety of the brick walls below. But if she abandoned the roof now, the wind would shred the exposed tar paper, exposing the bare decking to the storm and setting her work back by weeks. She refused to climb down. She hooked her left arm securely around the heavy base of the brick chimney to anchor herself, and used her right hand to pull galvanized roofing tacks from the deep pocket of her sweater. She could not feel the metal tacks between her frozen fingers. She had to rely entirely on visual confirmation to position them. She swung the framing hammer with short, brutal, imprecise strikes, driving the tacks through the thick paper and deep into the solid pine decking. The wind roared, a physical, deafening pressure against her eardrums, but she fought it back, inch by agonizing inch, securing the edges of the underlayment until the entire surface was firmly anchored and sealed against the gate. When the final tack was driven home, Clara carefully extracted herself from the chimney and crawled backward down the slick, terrifying slope of the roof. She slid through the open window of the 2nd floor and collapsed onto the dusty floorboards. She was soaked to the bone, her wool sweater heavy vague, kept heart sleet, her hands bleeding and entirely devoid of feeling, but as she lay there in the dark, listening to the storm batter the outside of the building in vain, she felt a surge of absolute, unadulterated triumph. She had fought the storm on its own terms, and she had won. She had defended her sanctuary. With the interior protected from the rain, Clara turned her attention to the structural integrity of the massive central chimney. While the firebox and the lower flue were functional, the exterior brickwork protruding above the roofline had been severely compromised by decades of freeze and thaw cycles. The mortar had deteriorated into a sandy powder, leaving the heavy bricks dangerously loose. December arrived in upstate New York with a harsh, unyielding cold. The temperature plummeted into the low 20s, turning the mud in River Alley as hard as iron. Clara climbed back onto the roof, carrying a heavy galvanized bucket filled with a historically accurate mortar mix she had researched in the manual. 1 part hydrated lime, 3 parts sharp masonry sand, and clean rainwater drawn from the yard pump. For the interior pointing of the firebox itself, she used a specialized refractory fireclay that could withstand extreme temperatures without cracking. The work was agonizingly slow. She had to chip away the old powdery mortar using a hammer and a narrow cold chisel, being exceptionally careful not to damage the historic red brick. Once a joint was cleared, she used a narrow pointing trowel to pack the fresh mortar deep into the cavity, striking it smooth so it would shed water. The air temperature was the greatest obstacle. Her bare hands would go entirely numb after 15 minutes of working the wet mortar. She adopted a punishing rhythm, 15 minutes on the roof, her fingers clumsy and aching with the cold, followed by 10 minutes huddled inside the workroom, beside the small, controlled fire, shikai pete burning in the lower grate. She repeated this cycle for 3 weeks. She watched the grey clouds roll heavy and low over the Hudson, threatening snow that held off just long enough for the mortar to cure. In late January, she performed a final test fire, burning a massive pile of dry oak scrap. The chimney drew the smoke perfectly. A strong, uninterrupted draft that roared quietly in the brick shaft, radiating a deep, enduring heat throughout the centre of the shop. The floors in the front showroom required a different kind of endurance. Beneath decades of ground in dirt, plaster dust, and black rot near the windows lay magnificent old-growth white pine planks. They were massive, ranging from 14 to 20 inches wide, secured directly to the joists with hand-cut, square iron rose-head nails. Clara spent 2 days carefully pulling up the 3 planks near the front windows that were too rotted to save, replacing them with salvaged pine she found in a demolition yard on the edge of town, using historically accurate cut nails to match the originals. She rented a heavy drum-style floor sander from Mr. Henderson for $14 a day. The machine was a violent, vibrating beast that nearly tore her arms from their sockets. She made 3 deliberate passes over the entire showroom. She started with a coarse 80 grit paper to tear through the blackened grime, moving to a 120 grit to smooth the deep scratches, and finally finishing with a fine 220 grit that left the old pine feeling like polished bone. She sealed the wood using pure tung oil, thinning the first coat by 25% with mineral spirits to ensure it penetrated deeply into the thirsty cellular structure of the pine. She applied 3 coats by hand, on her knees, rubbing the oil into the wood with a soft cotton rag, allowing 48 hours of curing time between each application. The grain of the white pine emerged from the grey dust, glowing with a deep, honey-coloured warmth. But the relentless physical labour took its toll. There was one bad morning in late January. Clara woke up shivering, her muscles locked in a rigid cramp, her hands raw and cracked from the mineral spirits and the cold. The sheer weight of the isolation and the endless punishing work suddenly felt insurmountable. She did not light the fire. She did not pick up a tool. She wrapped herself in her heavy wool sweater, walked out the back door, and made her way down to the icy banks of the Hudson River. She stood on the frozen mud, watching the dark, heavy water move beneath shelves of jagged shore ice. A great blue heron, a solitary slate-grey sentinel, stood perfectly motionless in the freezing shallows, waiting for the current to deliver a meal. Clara watched the bird for an hour, mesmerized by its absolute stillness, its quiet endurance in a hostile landscape. She realized that survival was not always about forward momentum. Sometimes it was simply about holding your ground. She did no work that day. She simply watched the river, allowing her body to rest, gathering the strength required for the next morning. February brought heavy, sustained snowfalls that buried Troy under a thick white blanket, muffling the sounds of the city and turning River Alley into a deep trench. Inside the shop, Clara turned her focus to the windows. There were 8 double-hung wooden sashes in total. 3 of the glass panes were missing entirely, replaced years ago by the warped pine boards. 4 others were severely cracked. Only 1 pane in the upper sash of the back workroom was completely intact. It was original rolled plate glass dating back to the late 1800s, filled with subtle waves and tiny trapped air bubbles that slightly distorted the view of the brickworks outside. Clara approached the restoration with meticulous care. She removed the heavy sashes from their frames, laying them flat on the oak work tables. Using a heat gun and a stiff putty knife, she carefully softened and scraped away the rock-hard, century-old glazing putty. She pulled the rusted glazing points with pliers, removed the broken shards of glass, and measured the wooden rabbets down to the 16th of an inch. She purchased replacement panes cut from standard float glass at the hardware store. Setting the new glass required a delicate touch. She laid a thin bead of DAP 33 glazing compound into the wooden channel, pressed the pane gently into the bed to create a watertight seal, and secured it with new zinc push points. Then came the true test of skill, tooling the outer seal. She rolled a rope of the oil-based putty between her palms, pressed it against the edge of the glass, and used the angled blade of a stiff putty knife to draw a perfectly smooth, beveled edge that would shed the rain. Before reinstalling the sashes, she replaced the rotted cotton sash cords. She purchased heavyweight braided cotton rope, feeding it over the cast-iron pulleys in the window jambs, and tying perfect, unyielding figure-8 knots behind the heavy lead counterweights hidden inside the walls. When she finally pulled the boards away from the front of the shop and slid the newly glazed sashes back into their tracks, the transformation was profound. The heavy winter light flooded the showroom, illuminating the honey-coloured pine floors and chasing the shadows back into the corner. On the morning of February 20th, a bright red northern cardinal landed lightly on the exterior sill of the front window. It tipped its head, looking through the flawless new pane of glass into the quiet room before taking flight toward the river. With the envelope of the building secure against the weather, Clara addressed the interior walls. The shop was finished in traditional horsehair plaster applied over wooden lath. It was a durable, historic method, but decades of water intrusion from the failing roof had caused the plaster to detach from the lath in 3 large patches near the central chimney. The wooden lath behind the holes was intact, but the plaster itself had crumbled into a chalky mess on the floorboards. Clara mixed her materials in the galvanized bucket, following the strict ratios in the manual. She began with a scratch coat, a coarse mixture of lime, sand and animal hair to bind the aggregate. She pressed the wet mud firmly through the gaps in the wooden lath using a rectangular steel trowel, ensuring it keyed securely behind the wood. Before it dried, she scored the surface horizontally with the edge of her trowel to give the next layer something to. 3 days later, she applied the brown coat, levelling the deep patches to sit just below the plane of the original historic wall. Finally, she applied the finish coat, a pure, smooth blend of lime putty and gauging plaster. She worked the steel trowel in wide, sweeping arcs, applying heavy pressure, burnishing the surface until the new plaster blended seamlessly into the old, the transition nearly invisible to the eye. She stood back, her arms coated in fine white dust, and placed her palm flat against the cool, smooth surface of the newly repaired wall. The structural integrity was absolute. These patches would hold another 100 years. Some places are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The tactile process of restoring the heavy wooden window sashes demanded a profound, unhurried patience. Clara quickly learned that the oil-based DAP 33 glazing putty could not simply be pulled from the tin and applied to the wood. The cold ambient temperature of the shop rendered the compound stiff and unworkable, prone to crumbling rather than sealing. To prepare the material, she had to scoop a handful of the grey putty from the tin and knead it aggressively between her bare palms for several minutes. The friction of her skin slowly warmed the linseed oil suspended within the clay, transforming the stiff mass into a pliable cooperative substance that smelled deeply of flaxseed and old workshop. She found a strange meditative peace in the repetitive labor. Drawing the beveled edge with the stiff blade of the putty knife was an exercise in absolute physical control. If she hesitated, or if she applied uneven pressure, the resulting seal would be jagged and prone to holding moisture, which would eventually rot the wooden rabbit all over again. She forced herself to breathe in time with the movement of her hand, pulling the blade smoothly from the corner of the pane down to the sill in one continuous, unbroken stroke. When she succeeded, the resulting 45-degree bevel was as smooth and flawless as poured glass. As she worked, carefully installing the heavy cotton sash cords and ensuring the lead counterweights moved silently within the hidden wall pockets, Clara considered the history embedded in the frames. These windows had stood against 70 winters before she had arrived. They had rattled against the howling gales blowing down the Hudson River Valley, and they had held fast against the driving sleet of 100 autumn storms. They had allowed the morning light to fall across the hands of Eleanor Vance and her father before her, illuminating the exact angles and curves of the heavy oak hat block. By restoring the glass, Clara felt she was not merely repairing a structural deficit, she was restoring the building's vision. For 24 years, the shop had been blinded by the heavy rotting pine boards, forced to endure the decades in total darkness. As she slid the final, perfectly glazed et hat back into its track and stepped away, the sudden influx of natural light was startling. The shop seemed to exhale, the deep shadows retreating into the corners, leaving the space open, bright and alert. The building was looking out upon River Alley and the churning water of the Hudson once again, standing watch as it had always been designed. As the winter slowly loosened its grip on the river valley, Clara realized that she was not entirely invisible to the town. The people of Troy did not intrude, respecting the deep, unspoken boundaries of a solitary worker, but they noticed her quiet endurance. Doris Pappas, the proprietor of the narrow Greek diner on River Street, was the first to cross the boundary. Doris was a formidable woman, verkepte, hat flower-dusted hands and sharp, observant eyes. She had noticed Clara's diminishing weight when the girl came in to buy black coffee on the coldest morning. In early February, Clara began finding a small foil-wrapped package resting on the stone threshold of the back door every Wednesday evening. Inside, still radiating heat, she would find heavy portions of moussaka, thick wedges of spanakopita, and warm, soft pita. When Clara finally walked into the diner, holding a hard-earned dollar bill to pay her debt, Doris simply wiped the counter with a damp rag and pushed the money back. "Put it in your pocket," Doris commanded, her voice thick with an Aegean accent. "Eat the food. Bricks do not build themselves, and you look like a strong wind would blow you into the room." Then there was Caleb. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered boy of 17, the son of a dairy farmer located just outside the city limits. He appeared in River Alley early one Saturday morning in March, carrying a heavy splitting maul over his shoulder. Clara had dragged several massive rounds of a downed oak tree from the vacant lot to her backyard, intending to split them with an old rusted hatchet, a nearly impossible task. Caleb did not knock on the back door. He simply walked into the yard, stood around on end, and brought the heavy maul down with a resounding crack, splitting the dense oak cleanly in two. Clara stepped out onto the back step, watching him work in silence for 10 minutes. Finally, she offered him a tin cup of water from the pump. He took the cup, his face flushed with the exertion. He drank the water in 3 swallows and handed the tin back. "My mother told me," Caleb said, looking at the woodpile rather than at Clara. "About the work you redoing here," she said. "Mrs. Vance made a mourning hat for her when my grandmother died back in 38. Didn't charge her a dime." He picked up the heavy maul again, testing the grip. "Reckon this pays the debt." He spent the next 3 hours reducing the massive oak rounds into a perfect geometric stack of seasoned firewood and left without another word. And every morning, just after dawn, Reverend Boyd walked past the head of the alley. He was an elderly Methodist minister, moving slowly with the aid of a silver-capped walking cane, his dark overcoat buttoned tightly against the morning chill. He never approached the shop, never offered unsolicited theological advice, and never pried into her circumstances. He would simply pause at the entrance to the alley, lean heavily on his cane, tip his black fedora toward the newly glazed windows, and call out in a rich, resonant baritone, "May the day be a kindly one." Clara would pause her work, holding a trowel or a piece of sandpaper, and watch the old man continue his slow walk down River Street. These 3 people formed a quiet, unobtrusive constellation around her. They did not demand explanations. They simply offered the vital, sustaining grace of being seen. In late March, while inspecting the joists beneath the heavy oak work tables for dry rot, Clara noticed a subtle discrepancy in the floorboard. One short section of pine, tucked deep in the darkest corner of the workroom, lacked the square iron heads of the rose nails that secured the rest of the floor. She wedged the flat blade of her putty knife into the seam and applied gentle leverage. The short board lifted away freely, revealing a shallow, dark crawlspace between the floor joists. Clara reached her hand into the dusty void. Her fingers brushed against the dry, crumbly masonry of the foundation wall, and then against something smooth and distinctly angular. She pulled the object out into the light. It was a small, heavy oak box, no larger than a brick, sealed with a brass clasp. The wood was perfectly preserved, protected from the ambient moisture by its hidden location. Clara unfastened the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside the box rested two items. The first was a heavy brass key, 3 inches long, cast in a highly unusual design. The bow of the key, the portion held by the fingers, had been forged into the intricate shape of a small spool of thread intertwined with a long needle. The brass was cold and heavy in her palm, completely untarnished. The second was a small, rigid tin-type photograph, the metallic surface coated in a dark, glossy emulsion. Clara held it up to the light filtering through the window. The photograph captured a young woman standing in this very workroom, leaning slightly against the central brick chimney. She wore a dark, heavy dress with a high collar, her hair pinned up tightly. In her right hand she held the exact polished bone folder Clara had found wrapped in the silk ribbon inside the hat. The woman's expression was serious, her eyes fixed on the camera with a steady, uncompromising intensity. Clara turned the tintype over. Written on the back, in the same elegant, sweeping Spencerian script she recognized from the letter, was a single line of faded ink. Eleanor Vance, daughter of William, age Jaime Lum, summer of Mortneen Sheen Bar. Clara looked from the photograph to the brick chimney. The room had not changed. The light falling through the window was the same light that had illuminated Eleanor's face 65 years earlier. Clara carefully placed the photograph back into the oak box and closed the lid, but she kept the heavy brass key. She walked over to the chimney and placed the key in the exact centre of the brick mantel. It sat there, a silent, heavy question, for months. April brought a steady, unrelenting, warm rain that washed the winter soot from the red brick exterior of the shop. The ice on the Hudson River broke apart with a sound like distant artillery, flowing south in massive, jagged flows toward the ocean. In the small walled backyard, the stubborn, invasive sumac pushed tiny, vibrant green buds through the grey. Inside the shop, the air was no longer hostile. The heavy, damp chill of decay had been entirely banished, replaced by the warm, clean scents of cured tung oil, fresh lime plaster, and seasoned oak smoke. The physical structure of Parcel Boncham High was sound. Clara stood in the back workroom, looking at the deep midnight blue velvet, the hand-forged steel needles, and the massive oak crown block resting on the table. She had spent the winter rebuilding the walls, but she knew she was not yet ready to take up the tool. The craft of millinery, as Eleanor had written, demanded patience and exactness. To touch the rare silk velvet with untrained hands would be a violation of the inheritance. She made a deliberate decision. She would not rush the craft. She would spend the summer practicing with cheap, discarded scraps of muslin and cotton. She would learn how the fabrics moved, how they responded to steam and tension, before she ever allowed the sharp edge of the shears to touch the midnight blue velvet. She folded her hands in front of her, breathing in the quiet, settled air of the room. The Milliner's shop was patient. So was she. 2 full winters passed over the Hudson River before Clara Bowden felt she was finally ready to attempt the craft. She had spent 24 months practicing on cheap muslin and discarded wool, learning the brutal, exact science of tension and steam. Only when she could block a perfect crown blindfolded did she untie the silk ribbon protecting Eleanor Vance's inheritance. She unrolled the midnight blue velvet upon the heavy oak work table. The fabric was magnificent, absorbing the light from the window in deep, fathomless pools of colour. She brought a kettle of water to a violent boil on the cast-iron stove, ensuring the steam rolling off the surface was precisely 212 degrees. She mixed her sizing fluid, carefully measuring exactly 1 part natural lac to 3 parts denatured alcohol, just as the letter had instructed. She warmed the massive oak crown block near the firebox, bringing the wood up to temperature so it would not shock the fabric. Then she began to work. She stretched the damp-sized velvet over the warm oak block, pulling with a steady, relentless physical force, pinning it into place with heavy steel tacks. The hot steam burned her knuckles, and the effort left her muscles trembling, but she did not stop until the fabric was flawlessly smooth, hugging the curves of the wood without a single hesitation or wrinkle. She used the hand-forged English steel needles to stitch the silk lining, her fingers moving with the quiet, intuitive grace she had learned in Beatrice Attic. It took her 3 full days to shape, stitch, and finish the piece. When she finally removed it from the block, it was a masterpiece of quiet structure, a classic, deep-brimmed cloche hat that felt both completely weightless and entirely indestructible. It was, as Beatrice had promised, a roof for the mind. The interior of the shop surrounding her was no longer a ruin. It was a sanctuary restored to its original, uncompromising dignity. The massive white pine floors gleamed with layers of amber tung oil, reflecting the heavy winter light. The horsehair plaster walls were pristine and white, entirely unblemished. The brick chimney radiated a constant, comforting heat. The oak work tables were oiled and organized, the tools laid out with exact precision. It was during this period of quiet completion that Clara finally resolved the mystery of the heavy brass key. She was applying a coat of beeswax to the thick, turned legs of the primary oak work table when she noticed a small anomaly in the grain near the top of the right-hand support post. She wiped the dust away and discovered a small, square brass plate set perfectly flush into the solid heartwood. In the centre of the plate was a narrow keyhole. Clara stood up. She walked over to the brick mantel above the fireplace, where the heavy brass key, the one with the bow shaped like a spool and needle, had rested undisturbed for nearly 2 years. She took it down, feeling its cold weight in her palm, and returned to the table. She slid the brass shaft into the flush plate. The fit was absolute. She turned her wrist, and the internal tumblers engaged with a heavy, oiled, deeply satisfying click.